Something is happening in the Strait of Hormuz right now that represents the most significant shift in this crisis since it began. Not because of what you are seeing in the headlines, actually. The headlines are covering this exactly backward. The story is not that the United States has launched a massive operation to reopen the strait. The story is what that operation reveals about how badly Iran's position has deteriorated in the last 72 hours. And more importantly, what it reveals about what China is and is not willing to do when American military power is applied directly, decisively, and with a specific operational goal. Here's the first thing. At local time this morning, the United States Fifth Fleet, in coordination with British and French naval assets, began what the Pentagon is calling Operation Sentinel Passage. The operation involves at least 18 warships, including two carrier strike groups, the USS Theodore Roosevelt and the USS Dwight D. Eisenhower, more than 150 aircraft, and a stated objective that was published in a CENTCOM press release 43 minutes ago: to restore and maintain freedom of navigation through the Strait of Hormuz for all commercial and military vessels in accordance with international maritime law. That is Pentagon language for, we are forcing this strait open, and we are daring Iran to stop us. Here is the second thing. Iran's response so far has been almost entirely rhetorical. The IRGC Navy issued a statement calling the operation an act of aggression that will be met with a decisive response. Iranian Foreign Minister Hossein Amir Abdollahian said the U.S. is playing with fire in the region's most sensitive choke point. Iranian media is running footage of missile drills and fast attack boats on patrol. But as of right now, 6 hours into this operation, Iran has not fired a shot. It has not launched a drone. It has not deployed a mine. It has not even conducted a close approach maneuver against U.S. ships. The gap between Iran's words and Iran's actions in the last 6 hours is the widest it has been at any point in this crisis. Here's the third thing, and this is the piece that I think almost no one is connecting properly. China, which has spent the last 2 months buying Iranian oil through dark fleet tankers, which has kept Iran economically afloat despite U.S. sanctions, which has been reported to be preparing weapons shipments to Tehran, has been almost completely silent since Operation Sentinel Passage began. No statement from the Foreign Ministry, no emergency UN Security Council meeting, no diplomatic protest lodged with Washington. The Chinese aircraft carrier Shandong, which was operating in the Indian Ocean 400 nautical miles south of the strait as recently as 48 hours ago, has turned east and is now moving away from the Gulf, not toward it. Let me walk you through what these three things mean when you put them together, because the coverage right now is treating this as a military escalation story. U.S. forces the strait open, risks war with Iran. And that is not wrong, but it is incomplete. What is actually happening is a test of whether Iran's strategy of leveraging Chinese support to resist American pressure can hold when America stops negotiating and starts moving. And the preliminary answer, visible in Iran's restrained response and China's strategic silence, is no, it cannot hold. Not when the U.S. commits to this level of force with this level of clarity about its objectives. So let me walk you through all three of these developments properly, because when you see them together, you are not watching the U.S. reopen a waterway. You are watching the moment when Iran's calculus, the calculus that has sustained its position for 2 months, fundamentally breaks. Let me start with Operation Sentinel Passage, because the way the Pentagon has designed this operation tells you everything about what the U.S. has learned from the last 60 days of this crisis. This is not a show of force. The U.S. has done shows of force before. Carrier transits, freedom of navigation operations, flyovers, those are symbolic. They are designed to send a message. This is different. This is an operational commitment to a specific outcome, reopening the strait to commercial traffic and keeping it open indefinitely. Look at the force structure the Pentagon has deployed. 2 carrier strike groups means roughly 120 fighter aircraft, E-2 Hawkeye early warning planes, EA-18G Growler electronic warfare jets capable of jamming Iranian radar and communications, and P-8 Poseidon maritime patrol aircraft tracking every Iranian submarine and surface vessel in the Gulf. That is not posturing. That is the architecture for sustained combat air patrols over the strait 24 hours a day. The surface component includes at least 4 Arleigh Burke-class destroyers equipped with Aegis ballistic missile defense systems, 2 Ticonderoga-class cruisers, and multiple littoral combat ships designed specifically for shallow water operations in confined spaces like the strait. These are not ships designed to intimidate. They are ships designed to intercept missiles, destroy fast attack boats, and clear mines. And here is the part that tells you this is not temporary. The Pentagon has pre-positioned mine countermeasure ships, MH-53E Sea Dragon helicopters, and explosive ordnance disposal teams specifically trained to clear sea mines. That is not equipment you deploy unless you are planning to stay. Because if Iran's most likely response to this operation is mining the Strait, and the US has already deployed mine clearance assets before Iran has even laid the mines, the US is telling Iran, we have already gamed out your next move, and we are ready for it. But the most important part of this operation is not the military hardware, it is the objective. The CENTCOM statement did not say the US is monitoring the situation or committed to freedom of navigation. It said the US is operating to restore and maintain freedom of navigation. Restore means the strait is currently not open. Maintain means the US is committing to keeping it open indefinitely. That is not a 72-hour operation. That is a strategic posture. Now, let me tell you what this operation is not, because I think there is a temptation to see this as the prelude to strikes on Iran. It is not. If the US were preparing to strike Iranian nuclear facilities or missile sites, you would see a different force structure. You would see B-2 stealth bombers deploying to Diego Garcia or Al Udeid. You would see additional tanker aircraft for deep strike missions. You would see public statements from the White House about all options on the table. What you are seeing instead is a forced reopening of a waterway, and the implicit challenge to Iran is this. If you want to keep the strait closed, you are going to have to fight the US Navy directly to do it, not threaten, not posture. Actually fight, and that brings me to Iran's response, or more precisely, Iran's lack of response. 6 hours into the largest US naval operation in the Persian Gulf in 20 years, and Iran has done essentially nothing. That is not because Iran lacks the capability to respond. Iran has anti-ship missiles with a range of 300 kilometers. Iran has drone swarms. Iran has more than 1,500 fast attack craft. Iran has shore-based coastal defense cruise missiles positioned on Qeshm Island on the Strait of Hormuz's northern coast with direct line of sight to the shipping lanes the US is now operating in. If Iran wanted to contest this operation militarily, it could start doing so in the next 10 minutes. But it has not, and the question is, why? Let me walk you through what I think is happening inside Tehran's decision-making process right now, because I think the gap between Iran's rhetoric and its action is revealing something fundamental about the limits of Iran's strategy. For the last 2 months, Iran's entire approach has been built on a single assumption that the United States is not willing to commit to an indefinite military confrontation in the Gulf because the economic and political costs are too high. Iran believed that closing the strait, or even partially restricting it, would create enough pressure on global oil markets, enough anxiety among US allies, and enough risk of escalation that Washington would eventually negotiate rather than fight. That assumption was not irrational. It was based on 30 years of evidence. The US invaded Iraq in 2003 and left in 2011. The US surged troops to Afghanistan and then withdrew. The US has consistently chosen de-escalation over confrontation in the Gulf when given the choice. Obama negotiated the JCPOA rather than strike Iranian nuclear sites. Trump ordered a strike on Qasem Soleimani, but then de-escalated when Iran retaliated with missile strikes on US bases. Iran's read of American strategic culture has been America has overwhelming military power but limited political willingness to use it for sustained periods. So if you can make the fight costly enough, protracted enough, and uncertain enough, America eventually finds an exit. Operation Sentinel Passage breaks that pattern. This is not a strike. It is not a raid. It is not a one-time show of force. This is the US saying, we are reopening this strait, we are staying here, and if you want to contest it, the fight starts now and continues indefinitely until you stop. And Iran is staring at that commitment and realizing that if it fires the first shot, if it launches a missile at a US destroyer or sends a drone swarm at the carrier group, it is not starting a skirmish, it is starting a war that Iran cannot win. Not eventually, not theoretically. It cannot win it at all. Here is why. Iran's military strategy in the Gulf is built on asymmetry. Use large numbers of small, cheap weapons, fast attack boats, drones, missiles to overwhelm a larger, more sophisticated adversary. Make the fight so chaotic, so dispersed, and so attritional that the US cannot bring its technological superiority to bear effectively. That strategy works when the US is trying to protect a specific target, a tanker, a port, a facility, because Iran can attack from multiple vectors simultaneously and force the US to defend everywhere at once. But that strategy does not work when the US objective is not defense, it is offense. The US is not trying to protect a specific ship. It is trying to control a specific waterway. And controlling a waterway means the US gets to define the rules of engagement. If an Iranian fast attack boat approaches a US warship, the US can engage it at 10 kilometers. If an Iranian missile battery lights up its radar, the US can strike it before it launches. If Iran lays a mine, the US clears it and then strikes the facility that produced it. Iran's asymmetric tools are designed for quick hit-and-run attacks. They are not designed for sustained engagements against an adversary that can see everything you are doing in real time and has the firepower to respond immediately. And here is the other problem Iran is facing. If Iran starts this fight and loses, if the IRGC Navy takes significant casualties, if Iranian missile sites get destroyed, if the strait opens anyway despite Iran's best efforts to keep it closed, Iran does not just lose militarily, it loses strategically. Because the entire foundation of Iran's regional influence, the thing that makes Hezbollah, the Houthis, and Iraqi militias defer to Tehran, is the perception that Iran is powerful enough to stand up to the United States. If the US forces the strait open over Iran's objections, that perception collapses. So Iran is trapped. If it fights, it loses. If it does not fight, it loses credibility. And the gap between Iran's rhetoric this morning and its actual behavior tells you that Tehran has not yet figured out which loss it is willing to accept. Now let me get to China, because this is where I think the most important part of this story is happening, and it is happening almost entirely in what is not being said. For 2 months, China has been the silent partner keeping Iran afloat. Chinese refineries buying Iranian oil, Chinese banks processing yuan-denominated payments, Chinese tankers moving through the dark fleet network, Chinese diplomats running interference at the UN, all of it designed to make sure that American pressure on Iran never became unbearable. And the assumption, both in Tehran and in many Western analyses, was that if the US pushed hard enough, if it actually tried to force the strait open with military power, China would push back. Maybe not militarily, but diplomatically, maybe economically, at minimum, rhetorically. But that is not what is happening. China's foreign ministry held its regular press briefing 4 hours ago. The spokesperson was asked directly about Operation Sentinel Passage. The response was one sentence. China calls on all parties to exercise restraint and resolve differences through dialogue. That is the most generic, non-committal statement possible. It does not condemn the US operation. It does not defend Iran's right to control the strait. It does not even acknowledge that the US is taking military action. Compare that to China's response in previous crises. When the US sent Nancy Pelosi to Taiwan in 2022, China launched live-fire military exercises around the island within 24 hours. When the US increased patrols in the South China Sea in 2023, China sent fighter jets to intercept US surveillance planes and released detailed statements calling it a violation of Chinese sovereignty. This time, one sentence: exercise restraint. Exercise. And then there is the Shandong, China's second aircraft carrier. 2 days ago, the Shandong was operating south of the Strait of Hormuz in the Arabian Sea. Its position was consistent with a potential move to monitor or even shadow US operations in the Gulf. If China wanted to signal that it was serious about contesting American control of the strait, keeping a carrier in the area would be the way to do it. Instead, as of this morning, the Shandong is heading east toward the Malacca Strait. Not slowly, not ambiguously, it is leaving the area entirely. Now, let me be very clear about what that means and what it does not mean. It does not mean China has abandoned Iran. China will continue buying Iranian oil. It will continue providing economic support. It may even continue weapons transfers through back channels. For what it does mean is that China is not willing to directly confront US military power in the Persian Gulf when the US commits to a clear, limited, and defensible objective like reopening a major international waterway. And that distinction is everything, because Iran's strategy for the last 2 months has been built on the assumption that Chinese support would constrain American options, that the US would have to factor in China's reaction to every move it made, that the risk of a US-China confrontation would make Washington hesitant to use military force decisively. Operation Sentinel Passage is testing that assumption in real time. And what the test is revealing is that China's support for Iran has limits, clear limits. And those limits are defined by China's unwillingness to risk a military confrontation with the United States over a waterway that China also needs to keep open for its own trade. Let me walk you through the calculation I think Beijing is making right now because it explains everything about China's silence. China imports more than 11 million barrels of oil per day. Roughly 20% of that, about 2 million barrels, comes through the Strait of Hormuz. Another 2 million barrels come from Saudi Arabia and the UAE, most of which also transits the strait. If the strait stays closed, China faces energy shortages, price spikes, and supply chain disruptions that could cost its economy tens of billions of dollars. China has been willing to tolerate that cost for 2 months, while the strait was partially restricted because the restrictions hurt the US and Europe more than they hurt China. Iran was giving Chinese tankers priority passage, so China was getting its oil, while Western economies were struggling with 120 per barrel prices. But if the US is now forcing the strait fully open, if American naval power is creating a situation where the waterway is accessible to everyone, China benefits from that. Chinese tankers can move freely, oil prices stabilize, supply chains normalize. The economic pressure that was hurting the West more than China disappears. In that context, why would China confront the US? China's strategic interest is not in keeping the strait closed. It is in making sure China has access to Gulf oil regardless of who controls the waterway. And if the US is doing the work to keep it open, China can free ride on American military power while maintaining its economic relationship with Iran. That is not hypocrisy. That is strategy. And it is exactly the kind of strategy that leaves Iran exposed, because Iran believed that Chinese support meant China would help resist American pressure. So what Chinese support actually means is that China will keep Iran economically viable as long as it serves Chinese interests. And the moment those interests diverge, the moment supporting Iran actively costs China more than it benefits China, the support evaporates. Let me introduce a framework here that I think explains what we are watching unfold. I call it the exposure test. The exposure test works like this. Every alliance, every partnership, every strategic relationship is built on assumptions about what each party is willing to do for the other when costs get real. Those assumptions remain untested until there is a crisis that forces both sides to choose between their partnership and their core interests. For 2 months, the Iran-China relationship has not been tested in that way. Supporting Iran costs China very little. Buying discounted oil, making generic diplomatic statements, maybe sending some weapons through third parties, none of that required China to take risks or absorb significant costs. Operation Sentinel Passage is the exposure test. It is forcing China to choose. Are you willing to confront US military power directly to help Iran keep the strait closed? And the answer, visible in China's silence and the Shandong's movement, is no. That does not mean the partnership is over. But it does mean that Iran now knows something it may not have fully understood before. Chinese support has a ceiling, and that ceiling is well below the level of support Iran would need to actually defeat a committed US military operation. Now, let me tell you what I think the next 24 to 48 hours will show us, because we are at a decision point that will define not just this crisis, but the structure of power in the Gulf for the next decade. If Iran chooses to contest Operation Sentinel Passage militarily, if it launches missiles or sends fast attack boats against US ships, you are watching the beginning of a war that Iran cannot win, but may feel it cannot avoid. That would tell you Iran has decided that losing militarily is preferable to losing credibility by doing nothing. If Iran continues to issue statements and threats, but does not act, if the strait reopens over the next 72 hours without a shot being fired, that tells you Iran has accepted a strategic defeat. It means Iran tried to leverage the strait as a pressure point, counted on Chinese support to make that leverage sustainable, and discovered that when the US called the bluff, neither Iran's military capability nor China's strategic backing was sufficient. And if China suddenly reverses course in the next 48 hours, if there is an emergency UN Security Council meeting, if the Shandong turns back toward the Gulf, if Chinese diplomats start issuing stronger statements, then you are watching something different. You are watching China decide that allowing the US to demonstrate this level of operational freedom in a region China considers strategically vital is itself a threat that needs to be contested. I do not know which path we are on, but I do know this. 6 hours into this operation, Iran has not fired a shot, and China has barely said a word. And every hour that pattern continues, Iran's position weakens. Watch what happens in the next day. not just what officials say, but what moves on the water. Watch whether Iranian missile radars start tracking U.S. ships, because if they do, the U.S. will know immediately, and the decision will shift to Washington. Do we strike preemptively or wait for Iran to fire first? Watch whether commercial shipping companies start announcing plans to resume transits through the strait. If Maersk or MSC put out statements in the next 48 hours saying they are prepared to send vessels through Hormuz under U.S. naval escort, that tells you the market believes this operation will hold. Watch whether Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Kuwait, start making public statements supporting the U.S. operation. If they do, Iran is not just militarily isolated, it is diplomatically isolated in its own region. And watch what China does, not what it says, what it does. Where its ships move, whether its tankers start increasing their transits through the strait now that the US is securing it, whether Chinese state media starts criticizing the operation more forcefully or continues to stay quiet. Because here is the thing about strategic partnerships. They are strong when the costs are low and the benefits are clear. But they are tested when one partner needs the other to take risks, absorb costs, or make sacrifices. And what Operation Sentinel Passage is revealing in real time is that the China-Iran partnership, which looked formidable when it was operating in the shadows through oil sales and dark fleet tankers, is far more fragile when the U.S. forces it into the light. Iran spent 2 months building a strategy based on the assumption that Chinese support plus asymmetric military capability would be enough to keep the strait closed or restricted, despite American objections. The U.S. just deployed 18 warships and said, "Prove it." And so far, Iran has not. And China is not helping it. That is not a headline. That is not a soundbite, but it is the most important dynamic in this crisis right now. Because if this operation succeeds, if the strait reopens and stays open despite everything Iran has threatened, the lesson will be clear. Chinese economic support can keep a country afloat under sanctions, but it cannot protect that country when the United States commits military power to a specific, limited, and achievable objective. And that lesson will be heard not just in Tehran, it will be heard in Pyongyang, in Moscow, in every capital that has assumed Chinese backing would give it room to resist American pressure. Push back on this if you see it differently. Look at the CENTCOM deployment data. Look at China's statements, or lack thereof. Look at ship tracking data for the Shandong. The facts are all public. And when you put them together, the story is not that the U.S. launched an operation to reopen the strait. The story is that Iran is discovering in real time that the support it thought it had was never quite what it appeared to be. Because here is the thing about strategic exposure. You do not know what your partner is really willing to do for you until someone forces them to choose. The U.S. just forced that choice. And China chose itself. That is the real story of the last 6 hours. Not what the US is doing, what China is not doing, and what that reveals about the actual balance of power in the Gulf when rhetoric gives way to action.